Hello and welcome to episode 6. We are coming up very quickly to 10 episodes, which I've decided that I think I'll do 10 episodes and call it a season, and maybe start working on how to present things differently in a second series, because we still have so many more guests that I want to get on the show from Germany, Italy, Austria, China, Iran, Australia, Sweden, a lot of people. But each episode takes a bit of time to produce, and I'm only doing one a week. But it's been good progress. So, hyvää juhannusta to the Finns. We celebrated Midsummer here recently. I think there was also Dien Rossi, the National Russian Day. So, June is quite a big time, I think. So there's been a few celebrations, which I've mentioned before and probably come up again, just how in the UK we just don't really celebrate anything. So it is quite sad that that is the case. But anyway, today I have a friend who is from Norway. His entire family, though, is from Denmark, I believe. So he's got some thoughts to share about both Norway and Denmark. So we've spoken about Finland, and we'll have an episode about Sweden soon enough. So we'll have a whole Scandinavian and Nordic section, though I don't actually know anybody from Iceland, so but I'm sure that'll come soon enough. This episode has been released a little bit late because Lida and I are in fact moving into a new apartment, which we're very excited by. It'll be about 10 square meters bigger, and we'll finally have a sofa, which honestly has been our main gripe, because when you're sitting around during the day, which we've all been doing a lot of because of coronavirus, it's nice to just have an actual sofa to sit on rather than either my desk or the bed, because, sitting on a bed all day isn't really good for you. So there'll be pictures of that to share in the near future. We'll be moving out very soon. But a little bit more about our guest. His name is Alex, and he's a geologist. And for those of you who don't know anything about geology, know it is not just about rocks, so don't tune out straight away. Geology is actually an incredibly interesting subject, one that I almost took further myself, but ended up going into material science instead, though there is a lot of overlap between when it comes to looking at minerals and so on. But so I'll have his thoughts to share about geology, and for example, Norway, as we know, its scenery is absolutely gorgeous, so we'll have a little bit to talk about there. And if you ever plan on going to Norway or Denmark, I'm sure Alex will probably have some little tidbits of advice to share regarding what to do if you're a tourist. Which honestly, while I'm here in Finland, is something I'm very interested in. I would love to do a round Scandinavia Nordic trip, so we'll see about maybe doing that this winter myself, and maybe I'll share something from my experiences as well. But hey, that's enough from me. This is episode 6, and welcome to the Tortcast. Welcome to episode 6 of the Tortcast. With us today we have, I don't know if you go by Alex or Alexander or Alec, but feel free to introduce yourself.
Yeah, hello, my name's, I usually go by Alex, but online it's usually Almarin or Alec, but in the end I just turn into Alex, I feel like, so feel free to go by that.
I feel like Alex is one of those names that seems to be popular in every single country.
Yeah, my parents went with, Alexander the Great as their inspiration, but a very common name in general. It's very lovely as well.
Okay, well, tell us a bit about yourself. So, from what I know, from what I can tell everybody, is that you're from Denmark and now live in Norway. When was this move? How have you found it?
So, I was actually born in Norway. However, my entire family, so with me being the absolute exception, everyone in my family is and has been born in Denmark. So it just happened to be that my parents moved to Norway due to work, and my mother didn't know that she was pregnant at the time. But when they got to Norway, they figured, "Oh, I'm pregnant," and then I ended up being born in Norway instead.
Okay, so I imagine your Norwegian is much better than your parents?
Yeah, much better. Well, my mother's been living in Norway for, I don't know, like 20, 25 years or something like that. So her Norwegian is considerably better than it was when it started, but still very Danish. So it's fun to listen to her speak to people sometimes.
Is it true that they are basically identical languages, though?
Yeah, they're extremely similar. However, depending on where you are from in Denmark, especially down towards the south near the German border, you're gonna start sounding almost foreign compared to people around Copenhagen or north of the German border. Pretty much, nobody understand those Danes at all. It's quite funny actually.
Yeah, I've seen even here in Finland that taking the mick out of how Danish speak is quite a popular thing, it seems.
I mean, the entire Nordic countries just take the piss out of each other with regards to their dialects and whatnot. So it's all in good humor in general, though.
And where does Iceland fit into this bond? Is Iceland fully included, or is it just
Iceland
kind of
is
there on the
is
side?
entirely excluded. Actually, it's not even a Nordic country, as far as I know, unless I'm mistaken. And their language, much like Finnish, is just completely different from what we have in Scandinavia. Well, it's a Nordic country, obviously, but it's not part of Scandinavia.
That's interesting. So I mean, I always see Iceland grouped together with all the
Oh
Nordic and
yeah,
Scandinavian
exactly.
cultures,
But
and
you have the Nordics, and then you have the Scandinavians, and the Scandinavians are only in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden.
yeah, I mean, the thing is, I have a controversial and unpopular opinion that I definitely think the UK should have been included as part of this much
See,
long ago.
this is quite funny because long before the EU, uh, the UK wanted to. Well, it was actually part of the Schengen deal together with Scandinavia, but the UK wanted more, so they joined the EU instead. However, now that the
Ooh,
UK has left the EU, they want to get back into the Schengen deal together with the Scandinavians, and they want none of it because the UK is a large economic force compared to Scandinavia, right? So if they were to rejoin the Schengen deal, the rest of Scandinavia most likely would just be pushed out.
yeah, I can see that. I mean, especially with the UK size and having a population of around
Mm.
70 million now, it's now, although there are very I've spoken about on previous episodes, there are many similarities between British and Finnish culture,
Oh, I see.
but because the British population is now 70 million, it's a widely different society
Definitely.
compared to Finnish society, despite the cultures overlapping.
I think one thing that most people might not even realize is that London city itself has like 10 million people or something. That's more than Norway, Denmark, or Sweden, which is
Yeah,
a ridiculous thing to think about, right? Like Norway is a large country, so is Sweden, Denmark, maybe not so much, but still one city in the UK having a bigger population than the other countries is almost unfathomable.
yeah. It's actually when I went to Lappeenranta in eastern Finland. It's a Russian town on the border
Hmm.
of Russia and Finland, and just on the other side of the border, you actually have St. Petersburg, which has a population of 15 million,
Oh yeah,
which is 3 times the entire population of Finland.
yeah, it's crazy.
So it was interesting as well though being there and kind of seeing well just how much more Russian there is in Lappeenranta compared to Finnish, and I'd moved from Moscow the year before, so it almost felt like I was back in Russia for a little while.
That's quite interesting. Yeah, you get that mixed culture.
Yeah, there's actually been an ongoing issue. Well, it's not really an issue, but so with Finland, the two main languages are Finnish and Swedish, but it is shown that there are more English speakers than Swedish speakers. So people have been saying that perhaps English should be made a national language,
Oh, that's
which I
interesting.
I heavily disagree with, to be honest, because you could apply that logic to literally any country
Of
in the world,
course,
pretty
yeah.
much. I don't think English has any necessity to be a national language,
No.
but Finland is actually really lacking in terms of its kind of well, it's employment services and so on. Nothing is in English. They only have everything in Finnish, and Finland is very much trying to be, because of its declining age population, it's very much trying to be a more international country. And so people are trying to look a way of like kickstarting getting English
I
into
see. Yeah.
into the economy.
So, for example, if I went there as a tourist, like I would only see Swedish or Finnish signs for everything. There wouldn't be any English.
When it comes to like food and so on, you will see English, yeah,
I
but
see.
it is still dominantly just Finnish and Swedish in a lot of places. More on the official side than the kind of
Hmm.
entertainment side.
I see. Well, it's somewhat similar in Norway. However, literally everyone in Norway has a passing amount of English that they speak at the very least. Although you'll only see English at the most necessary places like airports, I believe, so far, and maybe in Oslo, in our capital.
Yeah, it sounds very similar. And to be honest, as an English speaker, as a native English speaker as well, it is. I don't know how I feel about it. On the one hand, it is very convenient that everybody speaks English so well here, but on the other hand, it almost makes it that little bit harder to actually integrate yourself into Finnish culture because you are immediately always seen as an English speaker and they will immediately speak to you in English.
Oh yeah,
And so it makes it harder to actually learn the language by
definitely see
using it in
that.
public life.
Definitely see that in all of the Scandinavian countries. I feel like, but I think that's mostly because, especially in Norway, we're forced to learn English at a very very young age. I remember my first English lesson. I think was in first grade of primary school, and like maybe we were just taught like numbers and colors and stuff. But even then, it's really integrated into the learning culture. I feel like. And I mean, it's great, obviously, because English is a very international language. But at the same time, it is quite young to start with it in general.
Yeah, it is very young, but languages are one of those things that
Just
the later you start in
absorb as
life
well.
seem to, yeah, if you start it later in life, it seems to be much harder. I mean, languages being taught in the UK is actually a very strong suit of British schools. I mean, pretty much every school does French. That's like a given.
Oh yeah,
But then in my school, I started with French, and then I did Spanish, and then I ended up settling and switching and doing German. But it's kind of unless you pursue a language degree, it's really never going to be part of your life again after school.
I definitely see that. I went to a small private school in Oxford called Lakewood Place School, and that was being a private school. It also had much more options in terms of learning languages, and like if I wanted to, like they would get me a Norwegian teacher even if that was something that I actually wanted to have. But they had German, they had Spanish, French, and even Latin as well, even though there were very, very few people that did Latin.
Yeah, my school offered Latin as well, but I chose not to do it. There were actually also, after school, you could do Russian, Japanese, or Arabic.
Oh,
but
that's
you
interesting.
Had to pay, you had to pay for those. And in hindsight, I kind of wish I did do that.
Yeah.
I ended up doing Japanese alongside my final year at university, but, and learnt Russian while I was in Russia, but I haven't really been in a proper classroom environment really since doing German at school. So, but yeah, so learning other languages as a native English speaker, I think people do find a bit more difficult, partly because you don't have as much drive to do it as you would, if you were going to a country that didn't speak English. When I was in Russia, I spent a lot of time and effort learning Russian because it actually helped. Whereas learning Finnish here in Finland, it's more just out of interest and because I want to be part of the country. And so, I'm fine with menus and I can order things. But most of the time, there's just no need to. Because not only that, like if I'm sitting with people and sitting there speaking to them in English, then the waiter or waitress or whoever also start speaking English. Yeah, they can already tell. It's not like I'm also going to be sitting there having my conversations in Finnish.
Yeah.
Ideally, I would, but that's going to take
might be a little bit
years.
difficult. Yeah. But how difficult would you say Finnish is to learn compared to, for example, Russian or maybe English even?
I have found Finnish a lot easier than Russian, in fact, which I'm not entirely sure of the reason. Mainly it's because in puhekieli, in the spoken Finnish, you can kind of ignore a lot of the grammar rules.
Really? That's quite funny.
Yeah, but the ironic thing is all the resources only really teach you the written Finnish.
Ah, okay.
So you start by learning all the written Finnish and learning all these grammar rules.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you actually hear somebody speak, and it's nothing like anything you've heard, anything you've seen before. It's because it's spoken Finnish. And it's a bit confusing at first, but then you kind of realize that they just ignore a lot of the grammar rules. And I mean, what gets me even more, and I speak about this a lot with Lida, my girlfriend, very often in Finnish, they will just include entire English sentences and phrases.
Oh yeah, we do the same thing.
Yeah, same in Norway, same in Sweden, same in Germany, same in France. Everywhere does it, but I honestly feel here in Finland they do it to the point that it's not even. I don't know. I just don't feel it's acceptable. It stops being Finnish.
Just throwing in large English sentences in the middle, or.
Yeah, like an entire sentence, pretty much, rather than just like a word or a phrase. Like they end up just doing entire sentences
That's
in
actually
Finnish,
something that's
in
very
English.
interesting as well, because I have a couple of Vietnamese friends, and I also eat apps. Well, there's actually a lot of Vietnamese small communities here in my town in Sandnes, and they actually have adopted doing the same thing. Like they adopt entire English sentences into their language as well, and you'd never think of that from like Vietnamese all the way in a South Asian country. It's very bizarre to hear them speak sometimes, because you just some all of a sudden I can understand half of the sentence, right, even though it's a
Yeah.
completely foreign language.
Yeah, and it's also the thing is that I kind of struggle with is that I feel like as you know, as somebody learning Finnish, if I was to just then include an entire English sentence, I would just be viewed as somebody who either didn't know what I was trying to say in Finnish, or it wouldn't be the right like
Yeah, I
sentence you
see.
could use in that way. Whereas native Finns just kind of do whatever the hell they want. Yeah, they just yeah, they can just do whatever the hell they like, and I suppose that's kind of that barrier between learning Finnish and then obviously being a native Finn,
Mm.
which is also people are saying is one of the big problems with employment here in Finland, is that pretty much everybody tells you initially that you have to learn Finnish to get a job here in Finland, which on paper seems like it might be true, but it is really not because it's 2020 and a lot of companies operate in English anyway.
Definitely.
Even though they say Finnish is required, most of the time it's not really required. If you have sufficient experience and are a good team player and all that, then you'll be fine. But it's breaking this barrier because a lot of people think they need to know Finnish and therefore learn Finnish. And then once they've learned Finnish to a sufficient level, they'll then be told, "Oh, you also need connections." They move the goalpost in a sense.
Yeah,
So a lot
that's
of
always frustrating.
so a lot of people who move to Finland find it really hard to get jobs because of this Finnish barrier, and then they say, "No, you need a Finnish network," and then they say, "No, you need previous job experience in Finland," which you might not have if you don't have a job in Finland in the first place.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. In Norway, it's somewhat different, I suppose. You're actually forced to learn Norwegian if you want to have a permanent residency here in Norway. However, if you do find work, and like it's not required to know Norwegian, obviously, but for permanent residency, you need to be able to speak Norwegian 100%, else you will literally be thrown out of the country, which has happened quite a lot actually. There's been this huge case going on, I believe, for 20 or so years of a Muslim leader called Mullah Kreka, and he's been a huge controversial figure in Norway for a long, long time due to his religious stances. A very, very radical person. And I think it was last year they finally managed to throw him out of the country because he refused to learn Norwegian, and he didn't have any work, and he was just creating issues within religious groups in Norway.
Wow, that's pretty interesting. That's like the polar opposite to the situation in Finland in a
Yeah,
sense. I mean, on the one hand, it sounds kind of nice that you do have to sit down and learn Norwegian, but on the other hand, having that looming pressure of if you don't learn Norwegian, you've got to leave.
yeah.
I can imagine that can be detrimental to some kind of immigrants' mindsets.
But at the same time, though, there's a lot of immigrants that come into the country either from like the Polish country, yeah, Slavic countries, or from Muslim countries, and what a lot of them do is like maybe or the man in the relationship learns Norwegian, but then the mother is just a stay-at-home mother and then just raises the children there, and they never learn Norwegian at all. So they don't integrate themselves into Norwegian culture at all either, which is another issue. That's happening a lot, definitely in Oslo, because there's a bigger Muslim immigration there than compared to the rest of the country. But I feel like that's kind of a sad thing, because like you're escaping a country. That's the only reason why you've been allowed to come into the country to begin with, and then you kind of refuse to integrate into the culture, which feels a little bit short-sighted, you know? They want to
Yeah,
continue their own traditional stuff, excluding women out of workplaces as well. A very big thing that they do still for some reason.
yeah, I understand that. I do think Some people say when you move to a country, you must learn the language, and I think that might be a little bit of a strong stance to have.
Yeah,
Because the
obviously.
point is, you must attempt to integrate into the culture you're moving to. Language or not, language aside, you must attempt in some way or other to actually become part of the society and community you're joining. And whilst I don't want to go too deep into the topic of refugees and the migrant crisis, because it is quite a deep rabbit hole to go down
Very,
in
very
Europe.
deep. Yeah.
But I do agree with the sense that, yes, you're fleeing your country, and I can understand there is a lot of incentive to want to hold on to your traditional values and your, life, what life was like in your previous country. But when that necessity conflicts with the culture that you're trying to integrate into, that's when it becomes a really slippery slope, because
Yeah, that's kind of like that's the only issue I have with it in general. Like,
yeah,
practice your religion at home or in private or wherever, I have no issue with it. But when you force it on others and you want to continue it in Norway, which is an extremely strong Christian country, it feels a little bit wrong.
yeah, that's then creating kind of tension that just doesn't really need to be there
Exactly.
within
Like,
a country.
we are extremely open in general. Well, there's always going to be racist in every country and every community, but in general, Norway is very welcoming of other religions, I feel like.
Yeah.
Which is good.
Just going back quickly to what I was about to say a few minutes ago about English speaking becoming a national language, which it won't. Somebody counter-argued with, well, actually, there's more Russian speakers
Really?
than English speakers in Finland, which is, I think, statistically true. And I don't think anybody's ever said about Russian becoming a national language, because I think that would pretty much insult Finland's honor.
Most definitely. I mean, they fought very hard against Russia, didn't they? On the border.
Yeah. We've spoken about it in the Finnish episode, but the Winter War and the Continuation War and everything between Finland and Russia is quite a spectacular part of history, I think.
Just even bringing that up seems like, rubbing salt in the wound almost.
Yeah, especially when you still have, in the center, you still have some streets that have, like, the Russian names underneath and things like that.
Wow.
So it's like, it's still kind of there. It's very fresh, I think, for some people. And, I think my girlfriend's great-grandfather, maybe, or might have been great-uncle or something, but he was a prisoner of war in the Continuation War.
Damn, okay.
And he never spoke about it even till he died. And they still have his spoon that was kept from when he was a prisoner.
That's interesting. It's quite similar in my own family as well. My mother's father, he was part of the Second World War and fought against the Nazis during the occupation of Denmark. And if I remember correctly, he was away for a very long time, and then one day he just walked down the road to the house where my grandmother was living at the time, just like, yeah, I'm back home again now. And then he never spoke a word about the war ever again, because he'd also been in a prisoner camp for a long time. So yeah.
Wow.
It's quite
imagine
sad.
Just coming back and to not even mention it. I mean, it's hard enough to imagine that if you just went on holiday somewhere, to come back and not even mention it, let alone to actually be in war or prisoner of war.
Just waltzed back into his regular life almost, and then he settled down as a I don't know the English word for it actually, but he was a brick master, I guess.
Bricklayer.
He built a bricklayer. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
He built brick houses and stuff.
Yeah, and that's not even that long ago, really. But
no.
I mean, it's an interesting. Another interesting part of European history, because here not here, but back in the UK, and in the US, obviously, when people talk about the war, people talk about World War II in particular, people only ever seem to speak about what Russia, the UK, and the US did. Nobody ever really speaks about what was going on within Central and Northern Europe.
Yeah, it's completely glossed over. But I mean, Norway under occupied Nazi. I mean, I can't remember. We had, I think his name was Risling. He supported the Nazi regime in Norway. Quisling, that was his name, not Risling. That's a wine. And him and his entire parliament were executed after the Second World War, after we kicked them out of Norway. And his name has become completely taboo to use in Norway. You're not allowed to use his name anymore at all if you want to name a baby. That's how deep the hatred goes for him and his regime, because they did
rightly so.
a lot of despicable acts in the Second World War, and there were a lot of resistance against him and his regime. Like, we had a heavy water facility here in Norway, which was bombed by like a small group of resistant fighters, so they couldn't create nuclear weapons.
Yeah, and all of these local aggressions throughout Europe are obviously what culminated to the defeat of Nazi Germany. It wasn't just kind of one push. I mean, meanwhile in Sweden, I still don't know much about what Sweden actually did during the war. I think they did kind of... I know they helped supply Finland against the Russians, but
yeah,
as I said in a previous episode, Finland's efforts in the war were quite interesting in the sense that they were sided with the Nazis to fight the Russians until the Moscow Treaty was signed, and then they kicked the Germans out of Finland. So they played the game really well, I think. But yeah, I haven't heard anything really about what went on in Norway. I knew Norway was Nazi occupied, but other than that, I mean, even that's hardly mentioned in schools in the UK.
Yeah,
they
it's
just
a very,
talk
very
about
small
D-Day
part.
and so on.
I think it's mostly because up until Norway was completely taken over, we were trying to stay out of it. We only supplied supplies to the UK, as far as I know, down to Denmark. But after we were taken over, we were essentially part of the German war machine, right? We just created resources for them to use and ship down back down to Germany. Yeah. And actually, one of the schools that I went to in Drammen, which is just south of Oslo, it actually used to be a hospital for German soldiers, and it was repurposed into a school. Obviously, quite a long time afterwards. But it's quite fun. Well, it's not fun, I guess, but it's interesting to see that they reuse it for much more beneficial purposes than keeping it as just some, or just even removing it.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. I could imagine at the time there must have been some pushback against repurposing a building like that for, especially for something that's around kids. People must have thought they'd just get rid of it. And here in Helsinki, actually, there used to be a quite grand Orthodox Russian building. I don't think it was actually a church or cathedral. It was more like an administrative Orthodox style building. And there have been pictures going around in like newspapers and Facebook in particular. Facebook's always famous for this. But there have been pictures going around of that building. And because it's been demolished now. It's been demolished, and it got demolished, I think, like 30 years ago, and was replaced with this really bland, like 60s, 70s style office building, right?
It's almost a shame.
Yeah, I mean, it is a shame, but it's interesting because if you look at the Facebook comments and everything, everybody's outraged, saying the previous building was so beautiful, it's part of history, you should have kept it, right? But if you just actually do a little hunt back and look at the 70s and when at the time it was demolished, the public overwhelmingly wanted to get rid of it because it was an Orthodox Russian building and they'd kicked the Russians out of Finland. Holding on to that was kind of bitter for those living here, and they wanted to get rid of it.
That's another interesting thing I find in America as well. Like you have the South, what are they called again?
The Confederate flag.
Yeah, the Confederates. Exactly. Yeah. They have these Confederate statues and everything. And most people, up until now, with all the Black Lives Matter stuff, seemed fine with having them standing around. But all of a sudden, when they're trying to fight racism on every front, no, now we need to get rid of them. Now they're offensive, but they were okay for the last, God knows, like 60, 70 years. It feels very hypocritical, in my opinion.
I don't know about hypocritical, though. I think a lot of people aren't even aware of kind of what the statues
maybe
around
not. Yeah,
are,
that's also another thing.
For. And the thing is, a statue is placed there as a symbol of what the society stands for. And so if what that society stands for now is different to what the society stood for back then, I think it's fair to replace the statues for something that's a bit more appropriate.
Of course, yeah, but I feel like maybe they should just put them in a museum to begin them with, then, instead of just having them out on display for all this time, even though the Confederacy completely lost. And the things they stood for were horrible. Like, I don't understand why they wanted to keep them in the first place. But
yeah, that's interesting as well. Like, there's a lot of people you see on the news, especially down south in the US, who are saying, like, they're waving the Confederate flag and saying it's part of their history and part of their roots, even though the Confederates were like a 5-year party and were literally the enemy of what is now the United States. It is the literal equivalent of flying a Nazi flag in Germany and saying it's part of your roots. You don't do that.
No.
So, yeah, it's interesting how things change over time and how the same thing can be perceived very differently over, just a few decades later.
For sure.
So, do you go back to Denmark? Have you been back to Denmark often to see family and so on?
Yeah, up until I was 14, I believe it was 14 or 15, can't remember exactly. We would travel down to Denmark every single Christmas and every single summer to see my grandparents. But then at 14 or 15, my mother and I, we moved to the UK due to work, and then it kind of stopped. I would only go there infrequently, basically. And then about, I think it's like 7 or 8 years ago, my father moved to Mauritius. And since then, I haven't really visited my grandparents, well, on my father's side anyway. And then on my mother's side, they all recently died as well. So that's another tragedy, obviously. But up until I was 18, I guess, I would visit my family pretty much every single year to some extent in
That's
Denmark.
Quite nice. Are there, the obvious question, first of all, are there any notable differences you find between Denmark and Norway?
One definite thing is the choice of Christmas food. In Norway, we have basically what is smoked ribs and a potato and Swede mash. Very, very common to eat for Christmas in Norway. Or you eat, for example, turkey. That's also been somewhat popular recently. However, in Denmark, you always go for the duck. The duck is like the national thing. Very, very delicious as well. So I guess that's a very small but very considerable difference. So every single year we'd visit Denmark and have duck there, and then when we got back home, we'd make our ribs.
I have to say the Norwegian Christmas dinner sounds a lot better. I do like duck as well, but actually they both sound a lot more closer to home, a lot more closer similar to the UK. Whereas here in Finland, it's... to my girlfriend, when you listen, I do love Christmas dinner here, but I think you might like the UK a little bit more, not to be offensive. But Finnish Christmas dinner, it's a lot of fish. You'll have sardines, you'll have... I cannot remember the names for the life of me of these things. Something I may have to look up after. But yeah, you have this kind of beetroot salad mix. You have your potato salad, but
that's
you have sardines
out
the can and things like that.
The beetroots.
Yeah, but the fact it's primarily fish-based is very un-Christmassy to me. Whereas ribs, that sounds good.
Yeah, ribs is always, it hits home. And it's nice. They spoke in it in a very particular way. First, it's salted for God knows how long. You buy it in store salted, and then you take it with you home to water it down, and then you add other herbs and spices you want while you smoke it in your own pot at home. And then at the end, you either put it in the oven to give it that extra little bit of crispiness, like delicious, or just serve it as they are, completely smoked. So it's very. You kind of incorporate your entire family into creating the dinner, which is quite nice.
I was about to say
delicious and stuff.
I was about to say that does sound a lot more family inclusive, whereas typically with British dinners, it's very much just kind of the typical thing is like your parents or whoever's just kind of sits in the kitchen for 4 hours and does their thing and then brings it all out, and then everybody eats it, and then they just kind of nap for the rest of the evening.
Yeah.
Whereas, having it more kind of family oriented with the cooking part as well sounds a lot better.
Quite lovely, yeah.
So what else? What else is different between Denmark and Norway?
Definitely, there's a lot more festivals that are celebrated in Denmark. For example, Midsummer is quite popular in Denmark. They always have, at least, well, my family on my mother's side is very farmer heavy. So they either own a farm or someone's owns a farm and so on. And we'd go to their farm and then they have this massive bonfire which will last the entire day pretty much, and then you eat great food and stuff. That's something you don't really see in Norway as much anymore, also because it becomes illegal most of the time during the summer because the weather's too hot, the grass is too dry, and they'll get tons of bushfires. Very fun. So you're not allowed to do that in Norway anymore. But in Denmark, it's still a very large thing. So
Midsummer's not as celebrated in Norway?
No, not really. It's just another day, pretty much. I think it's also because we have our national day, the 17th of May, in Norway, quite close to midsummer as well. So that's celebrated obviously a lot more than in Denmark because their national day is not the 17th of May.
Yeah, they celebrate tons of stuff here in Finland. I'm always surprised because in the UK we don't celebrate anything. So it sounds very similar to, well, not similar, but more like Norway, I suppose, than Finland. Because, I mean, what other national celebrations do you have in Norway?
We pretty much only have the 17th of May as the big thing. For children, we also have something called Lucia. I'm not quite sure what it is in other languages, actually. But it's late November. It's pretty much like leading up to the... I'm not a very big religious person nor Christian, but you have the 4 Sundays before Christmas. I can't remember
Advent,
what it is. Yeah. And then before that, you have Lycea.
I can't remember if they do that here in Finland. They probably do. I mean, but yeah, no, Midsummer here as well. It's very much celebrated. Like everything closes and then everybody's out from about 9 p.m. With drinks and so on.
That sounds lovely.
And I think it is more the religious families that celebrate Advent here in Finland.
Yes,
but
Advent,
it is also quite commonly accepted. Whereas in the UK, we just do Advent calendars and you get your chocolate and that's it.
Yeah, Norway in general is quite boring unless you're into music festivals. There's a lot of those, but religious and holy days, we don't have that many anymore. We just pretty much have Easter, Christmas, and fall as our big major holidays for the most part.
You don't hold on to any Viking traditions?
None at all, sadly. We are a very placid, or not placid, but a very contemporate, I guess, culture now. We try to please everyone.
I mean,
I guess
out of interest,
that's a good thing as well.
Yeah, that is a good thing. Out of interest, I have to ask the stereotypical question. Do they teach any Viking history in schools?
They do. There's actually a large focus on knowing kind of our roots, I guess, to a certain extent, because we have the big guy called Harald Hårfagre, which means Harald Fair. Like he had fair hair.
It sounds a lot worse in English.
And he was pretty much the first king of Norway. He was the first man who managed to kind of combine all of the different Viking clans in Norway under one flag, pretty much. So he's a pretty big guy in Norwegian history. And we also have a couple of other battles that were quite known, I guess, because a lot of it is difficult to find out if it's real or not. Like you have your the Edda, which is our Viking book of folk tales, I suppose it is. And some of it is just folk tales and didn't actually happen, but some of it is quite real, and we found a lot of evidence of it being real.
I mean, the Vikings were quite a big part in the UK as well, but that's something that just isn't ever touched on in schools. And I always, another thing I find funny is that a lot of foreigners often say the UK has a lot of strange sounding towns and villages in their names.
That's our fault.
Yeah, a lot of them are because Viking names, as well as the many, I mean, the Romans as well, and the French occupation. And yeah, I mean, there have been many occupations within the UK. And so you have this kind of weird cluster of all different kinds of languages having their own names of places.
I think a lot of it, like, it wasn't only Norway either. Like, you have a lot of Vikings coming from also Sweden as well as Denmark, that obviously also raided the English coast. But yeah, Norway was a large part of messing up the English coastline up north. So deeply sorry for that. Please have some oil now. That's our new greatest export.
Yes, and that actually brings me very nicely on to my next question. Because, yeah, I think oil is what, 20% or something of the Norwegian economy now?
It's very,
a
very large,
significant chunk. And, well, so the next question I have to ask, were you inspired to become a geologist because of living in Norway? Did that have any part of it?
Some part of it, yes. My mother, she is a reservoir engineer. So what she does is she gets handed data pretty much, and then she's supposed to find out, oh, is there oil here? How much is there here? And how
Okay.
can I bring up the efficiency of how much oil we can produce, pretty much.
Did you go into petrology as well then, or?
So that's been a large factor in what I chose. However, it's been extremely difficult to get into petroleum-related sciences for a very, very long time because it earns the big bucks and it's very popular. But after the oil crack a couple of years ago, it became a lot less popular, and they started opening up for more people, pretty much, and that's how I snuck in. And
Okay.
I could have gotten into only studying petrology. However, I thought geology might be a slightly more interesting and a slightly more broad subject as well, since you get to study not only the petroleum side of the business, but also more of the well, obviously the geology side of it, like looking at the rocks and the foundation of our Earth, and not just look at where the oil is, pretty much. So I thought that could be quite interesting.
Yeah, I'm a material scientist myself, and because of part of the Cambridge course is you do geology as an option for your first year of your course. So I specialised in material science, but I also did geology for the first year, and I very much because basically a lot of Cambridge graduates go and work for BP and just big petrol companies. You could clearly tell within the first year of the geology course that there was a big push for a lot of the geologists to go into petrology, from the mapping projects to the kind of to the formations you'd look at. It was very much centered around finding where you might be able to potentially find oil and so on.
There's still a large focus on that as well, where I study now in Stavanger. However, there are a lot of sciences or courses you can take on the side that are much, much more focused on just the geology aspect of it. And that's one of the courses I'm doing now, actually, is we're remapping an area that's already been mapped by the Norwegian, it's called Norske geologiske undersøkelse, which is like Norwegian Geological Searching and Mapping Institute. And on the first day we were out on this small island, we already found like discrepancies of what they've put onto the map and compared to what we've found.
And that can lead to some big finds, I imagine, if things are put down wrong.
It's quite funny because obviously, because that's an official institute, they have a limited amount of time and resources and money they can spend on mapping this tiny little island off the coast of the city that we're in. So it wasn't that important, I guess, that it was accurate, but we found it quite funny that we can find stuff that's been ignored pretty much in the course of a couple of hours.
Yeah, and that's actually a big thing throughout a lot of scientific documentation, is that a lot of official institutes lack the funding to do things necessarily properly.
Definitely.
So when a corporate firm takes the job over, they end up being able to channel so much more resources into it that they can find discrepancies between the official data and their data.
And the reason why we were sent out there actually is because the cathedral in Stavanger, they think that the rocks that were used to build it came from this island. So that's another reason why we were sent out there, to see if we could find the same rocks or the same rock type that was used to build the church. If we could find or the cathedral, you could find those out on that island. And we did find something that looked like it could have definitely been used for it. Like, you obviously need large blocks of a singular rock that can actually be formed like into a square or rectangle or such forth, so you can actually use to build with it. And most of the island, it was just like it was impossible. You would never be able to mine anything out of it. But we found on one side of it really, really large, flat. It basically looked like someone had mined or quarried these rocks away, because it just looked really bizarre in general. So maybe we found where they built the cathedral from, and then they just took it out on the boats and then into the city.
Yeah, that's interesting because a lot of people do, from my experience, do tend to kind of shit on geologists because they think it's just about like just rocks. It's a big thing, at least at university, where I mean, even amongst the
There's
scientific
definitely a
community,
lot
still
of
people
stuff
have this.
within that.
Yeah, people have this obsession with physics being like the greatest and the best, when actually there are so many different subsciences that are so much more interesting and even, dare I say, more important in terms of their direct application. And so, yeah, even with, geology as well, it's interesting that it's not just about petrol, it also has a huge part in history or paleontology or whatever else. Personally, my favourite part of my time doing geology was actually the microscopy work, because in material science we spend a lot of time with crystal structures.
Oh yeah,
so
very interesting.
Yeah, so that was kind of my, looking at the birefringence and cleavage planes and things like that.
Oh yeah, delicious.
Microscopy. But I was also quite interested in the fossil work and that sort of thing.
There's very few fossils in Norway, sadly. We just have the rocks. Quite boring.
But I do find it interesting that the three biggest geologists that I know are yourself in Norway, a friend from Nepal, and a friend in Scotland. So it's very much a wonder their location kind of influences whether they become a geologist or not.
Yeah, well, see, that's the funny part, because Norway, Scotland, where was you? Nepal?
Nepal, yeah.
I need to actually, where is Nepal?
My geo.
Oh, okay, yeah. Because I believe, yeah. This is very, very interesting, because you might not know this, or you probably do if you're a geologist. But you have the was a Caledonian orogeny, which is with the Baltic and the North American continental plate colliding to create Norway, pretty much. However, the rocks found here along Norway are the same rocks that you find near Himalaya. Those are the same rocks. So even though Nepal, Scotland, and Norway are quite far apart from each other, you find the exact same orogeny in those places.
Yeah, it's partly as well, why Scotland is, the UK in general is crazy diverse in its rock formations, because I think we went on an expedition to the Isle of Arran, and it's like a particular island that has this exact crossing point between basically.
Oh, yeah, that's nice.
Yeah, between basically the clay south and then the northern mountains.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, so that's geology, and I think we do have a geologist who's going to listen to this, so I'm sure she'll have some questions.
Hopefully, I'm not saying anything wrong to make myself sound stupid.
No, I'm sure you're not.
Still only a small student.
So moving on from this, there's one kind of similar topic that I just want to bring up. This would probably be our controversial topic for the day.
Sounds good.
It's not really controversial at all, or in fact it shouldn't be, but basically, as somebody who's worked in geology, I suppose it'd be nice to hear your share on the whole climate change ridiculousness. And I don't mean ridiculousness as to whether it's real or not, but as in how the media and everything portrays it and how the public has responded to it.
See, this is a very interesting topic, because in Norway, we are green crazy, to say the least. We have an entire party that has built themselves up on being just green issues. However, it's great that they come up with these green ideas, but the way they implement them is completely horrendous. In fact, the current government in Norway, I'm a Danish citizen. I'm not even a Norwegian citizen, despite living here for 20 plus years or so, because you weren't allowed to have dual citizenship for a very long time. Okay. So I can't vote for a government, but I can vote in regional stuff, basically. But the current government is of the right, together with the moderates in the middle, and then the Green Party. Because the Green Party has a voice in the current government, they can implement what they think is good for Norway as a whole for green stuff. And in 2019, I believe we had like 3.6% less CO2 emissions or something like that. Massive reduction, right? Great success. Except the only place where these green ideas were implemented the most was in Oslo, the capital. And Oslo had the largest increase in CO2 emissions during that same year. So the rest of the country is making up for these ridiculous green ideas that don't even work. And then they just pat themselves on the back, like, good job, we did a good job, except you fucked it up, quite literally. And they want to continue in government. And I find it absolutely ridiculous. I will never, ever, ever vote for them because they are so stuck up and they don't actually have any effects on Norway as a whole. And the worst part is, this is just me speaking from a petroleum side of things. They want to shut down and cripple the oil economy in Norway, which is absolutely ridiculous. One thing is, it's a huge part of our economy. It's also a huge part of the how Norway has money, like its equity basically, is our oil fund, which comes from the oil industry. So if you kill the oil industry, you kill Norway's oil fund. This doesn't seem very clever. So yeah. I mean, yeah, sure, it's really great to have focus on making sure that, because Norway as a whole has ridiculously high CO2 emissions compared to other countries in Europe, but that's because we are a oil producing country. A lot of our emissions come from us producing, which is obviously bad, but at the same time we're also trying to reduce this as much as possible. Like, you might not realize it, but Norway is one of the largest importers of electronic vehicles in the entirety of the world. Like, we have the most green or electric vehicles per capita in the world by a large margin. But even that is not enough to reduce our carbon emissions at all, because we just produce way too much.
Yeah, but being an oil-producing country, as you said, and the fact that that's such a huge part of the economy, it's much harder to tackle.
Exactly.
But I think, as you said, or indirectly a moment ago, is the idea that a lot of people seem to be confused with the sense that you can, as a country, both use oil and renewable energy. And
like, our entire electricity network is renewable. It's only from hydro.
And that's pretty fantastic, and it's an achievement that I feel doesn't get as much credit as it should. And the sad thing is, whenever anything confusing or a green attempt has messed up, it goes to the papers and it puts a lot of people then off any kind of green initiative. It's good that there is a Green Party that's really popular, and we do have a Green Party in the UK, but it's minuscule. Politics in the UK is a shamble, as you know, and the Green Party gets such a small percentage of votes that it's pretty much non-existent.
Yeah.
Here in Finland, the Green Party is doing very, very well. I wouldn't be able to say, but I'm pretty sure it's like one of the top 3 or 4 parties. And,
that's quite impressive.
Yeah, in fact, just to bring up, actually, just for the Black Lives Matter episode last week as well, there was a Green MP here who was black and gay. Yeah, I think his name is Jani Toivola, which, as a friend said, is a straight, white, right-leaning man's nightmare. But yeah, he actually was very successful during his time as an MP. And I just think that goes to show that, you know, the UK does still have many more steps to take in terms of its progressiveness, albeit you can't directly compare between the UK and Finland. But, you know, it's something. And the fact that Green Party is getting that recognition as well is good. But anyway, yeah, so having a Green Party is a good thing. But I feel that bridge between the initiative and the implementation is something that is still very much yet to be crossed, as well as how you deliver that to the public. Because, I mean, I read an article yesterday that, I mean, as somebody who has done a scientific degree and knows a bit more about it, to me it's pretty shocking. But I can imagine to somebody who does not really understand statistical significance, may be just confused. But for example, there was an article and it was saying there's this village in northern Russia that reached a record high 40 degrees, which you know, people then use as evidence for climate change. But then they go and state in the article that 100 years ago, the record was 37.7 degrees, right? And I can imagine, as somebody reading that, you might think it's 0.3 degrees in 100 years. Like, who cares, right?
Yeah.
And I feel it's those sorts of publications, those sorts of articles about climate change that are probably actually doing more damage than good into making a step forward with the Green Initiative.
You only need especially like on the ice glaciers, like you only need a tiny amount of change to suddenly start the melting process, and then you're fucked. Like you can't go back. Once these glaciers start melting, you're gonna lose them. And especially in northern Russia, I believe, like they have a lot of methane gas captured underneath the ice. So if this starts melting and gets into the atmosphere as well, that's going to be a large contribution as well, maybe, to emissions.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's incredibly important, but articles fail to actually highlight that bit of the damage because it's too complex, too intricate for a lot of the public reading to actually understand it. And so instead, you get a lot of typically right-wing older folk who don't quite understand it. They read it and they're just like, "Oh, it's 0.3 degrees. Who gives a shit? This is stupid. It's a waste of money." So I do think the Green Initiative entirely does need a kind of rebranding as to how it approaches.
I think it's very difficult because you can't just tell each individual household to be more green. Like it needs to be something that the whole population population as a whole can work towards. Just not be like, "Oh yeah, turn down the heat in your house and you're going to help green gas emissions." Like most people aren't gonna bother with that. That seems like such a small thing that nobody would ever bother with.
Yeah,
so you need to have some kind of initiative that as a whole the population can work towards. I think is something that might be good.
I mean, also public loves to pick up on bad science. I mean, social media and stuff has been around long enough that you can start drawing patterns between, for example, how people respond to climate change and how people respond to vaccines, that it causes autism because of that one bad paper. And, for example, directly, right now with coronavirus and the masks, how people respond with masks. And so it's pretty bad how the science is now actually being ignored because it's being explained and implemented so badly that people are now doing the exact opposite of what is intended. So the next thing I just wanted to ask is, as a geologist, I have found quite from the people I know, are you a fan of extreme sports?
One thing that I've been a part of as a kid and now is karate. Might not be as extreme as some stuff, but the particular one that I do called Kyokushinkai is a full contact type.
How many bones have you broken?
I haven't broken any yet, luckily. But
it's not that extreme then, is it?
No. But we're getting to the extreme part because you're not allowed to compete in full contact until you're above a certain age and above a certain grade, because they don't want people to be hurt, like broken bones and stuff, and then put off it before they're actually like good enough to be able to have some kind of defense against it,
Okay, yeah.
So my friend, who's been doing it for, I think it's around 15 years now, he is a black belt, and he's part of the Norwegian national team, and he's broken a lot of bones and been damaged quite a lot. But he's been competing all over the world, almost in different tournaments, and is one of the main reasons why I came back to it as well. It's quite fun, but obviously you do get badly damaged and bruised from time to time.
How many years did you say you've been doing
it? He's been doing it for around 15 years. I restarted it again 3 years ago now, but I did it quite a lot when I was a kid as well, and that's when he started as well. I just didn't continue at the time as I moved to the UK.
So I was going to say, was it to defend yourself in the UK? Or?
No. Luckily, there weren't any chavs where I lived. Lived in the posh part of Oxford.
Okay, yeah, you got lucky there.
Exactly.
Okay, I mean, if I recall, did you say you did a cross-Japan trip?
I did, yeah.
Did you do any skiing? or anything as well?
Sadly, we went in the depth of summer, so it was 30 plus degrees every
Okay.
single day. No snow to be found. Well, we were in Sapporo, all the way up in North Japan, and even during the summer there was some snow some places, which is quite impressive. But it was extremely hot up there.
Yeah, I can imagine the humidity in a lot of Asian countries is quite crippling.
It is horrid.
Whereas the weather here has been fantastic here in Helsinki. It's been about 30 degrees, and
Same.
there are so many lakes that you can just cool off anywhere. So
Yeah, I live on top of a mountain, quite literally. So we get some wind that helps keep the temperature down, luckily. But the past week, it's been absolutely horrible. Zero wind, just like 30 plus degree weather, battering you down. It's not very pleasant.
yeah. But now going back to the cross Japan trip, actually, it's something that I've been wanting to do for a while. Probably, I was thinking maybe from Okinawa through to Kyoto, Osaka, Tokyo, and then up to Sapporo as well. But mainly the thing that I would like to do if I only had to do one is that I really want to go snowboarding again, and I would love to go to Sapporo to do it. Which I then, because I may not be able to go to Japan for a while, because A, it's expensive, and B, who knows what's up with travel recently. We're coming up to another winter, so I just wanted to ask, what is skiing and snowboarding like in Norway, do you know?
Oh, actually, it's very accessible. You wouldn't believe it. For example, in the city that I lived in was a kid called Drammen, just south of Oslo again, actually has a ski slope, like just on, like behind a housing area, pretty much. So you have this entire, tons of houses, and then at the top you just go up to a ski slope. Takes literally 5 minutes to get there, and that's one side of the city. And then on the other side you have one that's around 20 minutes away if you wanted to go there as well. Like, skiing is ridiculously accessible in Norway as a whole.
That's good to hear, because Finland, as you know, is very flat, so it's more cross country skiing, which is
cross country is fun, but it's not as exciting maybe.
Yeah, and I mean, I've never skied. I've only been snowboarding once, so I'm kind of looking forward to doing something like that again.
Oh yeah, I mean,
Sweden
snowboarding is the same. It's a very, like, if you can ski somewhere, you can snowboard here in Norway for sure.
Yeah. Sweden, I don't plan to go to anytime soon because of how they've handled coronavirus.
Which, unsurprising.
For those who don't know, I think Sweden officially stated recently, even if you test positive for coronavirus. Even if you test positive for coronavirus, you're supposed to still go to work, which I think is a pretty messed up statement to make. Yeah. But yeah, I think the Norwegian-Finnish borders, I think, have been reopened already.
Yep.
As well as Denmark
as well.
So so I'm planning to maybe this winter do a Denmark, Tallinn, Estonia, and Norway trip. So, I suppose that brings us on nicely to wrapping up this episode. I just want to ask you, for anybody listening, what would be your top suggestions to say for those going to either Norway or Denmark?
Okay, so for Norway, since I'm a West boy, I was born on the West Coast, so I'm obviously biased towards this side. Definitely come to Stavanger or Bergen. Both are absolutely wonderful cities and have a lot of culture to be found here, either through fishery or through hiking or museums in general. Like in Stavanger, we have the Oil Museum, which is very, very popular and extremely good. But we also have a lot of fishing museums, because fishing was a big deal before the oil. And it's also wonderful hiking trips, obviously. The mountains are unbeatable almost. If you go into Denmark, I guess it depends on what you enjoy. Like Roskilde has its festival every single year, I believe, which is obviously a huge attraction for the young crowd as well as the old, if you're into that kind of stuff, and it's definitely worth going to. Other than that, they have a lot of Viking museums as well, all across the country, which are also worth visiting. Or if you just want to go on a nice trip, seeing the wonders of Denmark, you have Skagen all the way to the north, which is quite fun to see. You can actually see the two different seas crashing together. It's the is it the Barents Sea and
Oh, wow.
the North Sea. You can
That's
see
a
them
hard image
colliding
to
with each
actually.
other.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting and very cool to see. Other than that, you also have the tallest hill in Denmark. I believe it's like 250 meters tall. I can't remember where it is, but that's also funny to see. They have a small train that goes up and down it in case you can't walk the 250 meters up. Very, very tough trip.
Do you say was Norway generally more expensive than Denmark?
Definitely, I'd
Yeah.
say, well, yeah. Sadly, Norway is a very expensive place as a tourist. But there are good deals to be found anywhere in Norway in general as well. You shouldn't get spooked because people say it's too expensive. It's quite affordable in general. Just don't go out to a pub. You'll be ruined.
Yeah, I
It
feel
costs
bad
too
enough
much.
paying like €7 for a pint here in Finland.
Yeah,
I imagine in
you're
Norway it'd be
paying
another euro.
10 to 13 euros for a pint in Norway,
Oh,
so stay away from the
I mean,
pubs.
imagine being a Viking and having to pay that much
Yeah,
to
I
get
know.
drunk.
It's awful.
It's very anti-Viking roots.
Mm.
I actually watched a Norwegian TV show recently, which was you may have heard of it, Beforeigners. I don't know
What's
if
it
you've seen it
called?
advertised. Beforeigners. It was on like
Beforeigners.
HBO Nordic, and basically it's set in, I think it's set in Oslo, and it's basically the entire concept is it's modern day Norway, but magically somehow out of nowhere Vikings from the past are
That sounds
like
hilarious.
arriving in modern day. So you have
I
these
haven't
people
actually seen
from
this.
yeah, so you have these people from like 1,000 years, 1,000 whatever years ago,
Yeah.
now trying to integrate and live in modern society. And I think the director said it was supposed to be a kind of touch on the current immigration crisis as to how people view refugees compared to how they may view, like, if you had literal Vikings coming into your country. But you don't really get much of that from the show, I think, other than the first few episodes. That was
Sadly,
interesting.
haven't seen it, so I can't comment on it, I suppose.
Yeah,
But yeah.
it was interesting. But one of the reasons we watched it was because the main actress was actually a quite famous Finnish actress.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
And Finland has a big habit, and I'm sure Norway does too. Finland has a big habit of whenever anything Finnish is mentioned elsewhere in the world, everyone's like, Torille.
Torille tavataan.
Yeah, just because Finland could have been mentioned for literally
Exactly.
anything.
You don't see much of Scandinavia in foreign media,
No.
sadly.
I think it was there was a film called Black Klansman, which was an American kind of comedy / parody film about, it was a black cop going undercover as a white cop.
Okay.
Interesting. Like he was talking, through the phone to the KKK, and they were like, "You sound like a great straight white man," and he was like, "Do I?" As a black man. And the Finnish newspapers were going mad about this this film, because there was a Finnish actor who was in the film, and I was like, "Oh, that's amazing, right?" And then it turns out literally the biggest white supremacist in the film is the Finnish actor, and I was like, "Did they do that on purpose, or?"
The whitest man they could find.
Yeah, the whitest man they could possibly find in all of the world, and put him as the white supremacist. But he actually, all the reviews and feedback, they were saying he was actually probably the best actor on the show. So that's great.
Yeah, I do feel like we export a lot of good actors out of the Nordic countries. Like we have Viggo Mortensen, the guy who plays a villain as well in the Bond movies. I forgot his name now, but he's also in a lot of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, going on a little bit longer, but is the mentality the same though in Norway as it is in Finland? In Finland, they very much have the attitude of, if somebody is successful and then leaves Finland, Finnish papers and generally the public are all like, "Oh, he'll be back. He's not going to do very well." Like, everybody hates on Finnish actors and whoever who leave Finland. It's a really weird state. Like, they're happy to see Finland mentioned outside of Finland, but yet the Finns themselves who leave Finland are kind of like disowned.
I'm not a big on the pop culture, I guess, in Norway, but for the most part, most Norwegian actors stay in Norway because they're just not successful enough to leave Norway in general. So you don't really see that as much, I suppose. But I know in Denmark, they're very happy to see mentions of their own country or their actors. I don't think they mind too much if they leave. But again, in Norway, I guess we do have some of the same mentality as in Finland. Like, Norway stays Norway. Like, if you leave Norway, you are suddenly not as welcome anymore. And at the same time, if you're not a Norwegian, you aren't welcomed as much either. We're a very closed off society in general, I feel like. It's a bit of a shame.
Yeah, it is quite a bubble that I think will be very hard to penetrate. I mean, especially with it's always one thought I had quite recently was the popular video game coming out, Cyberpunk 2077. Just trying to imagine that sort of society ever coming to Scandinavia in like
it's hard to believe.
You know, I just can't see that kind of futuristic city, people from all backgrounds kind of culture ever popping the Scandinavian bubble. Whereas in the UK, I mean, the UK I could still see it, although it's a bit archaic, but yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming on to the show, Alex.
No worries, it was fun to be a part of it.
If you've got any final comments, just feel free.
Yeah, I guess Norway or Norwegians are truly born with skis on their feet. I guess that would be my closing comments.
Big thanks to Alex for coming onto the show. Hopefully that provided some insight as to what life is like in Norway and the polar opposite of how much time you should be spending in pubs compared to the UK. So just a final few things from me. Well, I'd just like to say congratulations, actually, to Yossi from work. He's had a baby girl, which, fantastic celebrations and all the best to him and his family. And I'd just like to say congratulations to us at the Tortcast. We've surpassed 100 listeners now, so a big thanks for the continued support, as always. And especially big thanks to everybody who listened to the previous Black Lives Matter episode, because it has any effort or input you have with something like this does make a difference. And I hope that in some way people can be inspired to take a little bit more action when they see discrimination in their everyday lives. But anyway, as for the next episode, I won't be announcing which country it'll be just yet, because I haven't 100% confirmed it. But there are some interesting options on the table, and I'll be working very carefully as to what kind of things we can discuss. So, as always, please just give a like on the Facebook page or follow the Instagram page, which I haven't actually started using yet, but it's good if I can gain some traction on Spotify or on YouTube. But all the best and have a good week. See you next week.